So our first talk is to be done by Lana Whiskeyjack, a multidisciplinary artist, writer, and researcher, and Kyle Napier from the University of Alberta. I'm very happy to welcome them. I saw them in the list of participants.
Yes, that's right. We're both here.
Great.
And it's possible I'll take on the actual presenting.
Okay, so you won't have a camera on.
I'll host the presentation while Lana and I will co-present.
Okay, great.
I will have one on right now. Okay.
I'll take myself out.
Okay, and I'll start sharing the screen here. A little bit of a sneak peek. Okay, are we good to begin? I see Lana's here as well.
Yes,
and I like your background. Okay, cool. So maybe we'll start. There's a few introductory slides, and we'll get going. So Tense kan Nitsikatsun maga niota moginstis, depend on who you ask, but I'm here to talk to you about languages and really reconnecting to the spirit of the language. So in a lot of Indigenous conferences or linguistic conferences involving Indigenous peoples, there's the reference to the spirit of the language. And so we've heard this over and over. And so the project that we're working on is the spirit of the language, of which Lana is the lead researcher and I'm the research assistant. And so in this project, we're pursuing three things. We're working with communities to put tangibilities around what is, right, the spirit of the language. Not tangibilities in an academic sense, as you'll find out, but what does it really mean? And working with community members and speakers to find that out. We also address what are the elements that have contributed to the disconnect to the spirit of the language. And this is an ongoing factor. It's been going on for 500 years. And then what are the community voiced methods to reconnect to the spirit of the language? So first I'll let Lana introduce herself.
I'm very grateful to be here. My name is Lana Whiskeyjack. I'm from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, and where the plains meets the boreal forest in Alberta, Canada. I'm educated from the first Indigenous owned and operated educational institution in Canada, which was also a former Indian residential school that 2 generations of the wombs I come from attended. And I also have acknowledgement of the wombs I come from, because when you introduce yourself in Cree, the root word for both my name is and I am from is Nitsi or Utsi, which is our belly button. So we're a matrilineal people who identified ourselves through our mother's lineage. And so Gototo is my great-great-grandmother, Maggie, Caroline, my grandmother, my mother, Nia, me. I have a daughter, and I'm also a grandmother to Amu. So, and when we're thinking of 7 generations with language, I think of all those interconnections. And I'm also an artist, and this is one of my art behind me is so thank you.
And anyone else in attendance will notice that Utsi, like where you come from, Nitsikatsa, my name, this is my root. And you can even feel that embedded within the language as one even just example of the spirit of the language. So here's me. I've already introduced myself. I'm Dene Cree Métis, Dene Nehio Métis from Tabacha Denende. So again, here's what our lit review really dove into, and we found that everything which contributed to the disconnect of the spirit of the language fell into 3 categories, and they are colonization, capitalism, and Christianity. We then began interviews and dialogue circles with community members to discuss, again, what is the spirit of the language, as well as means to reconnect. And then we're also collaborating with community members as to how to share those voiced methods of reconnection back to community members and in the larger academic fora, if that's what's chosen by academic members, or by community members. By community members, I mean fluent speakers of Nehio, or fluent Nehioan speakers, and those who are emerging learners. So here's just kind of like a large overview of what the literature review brought for us in terms of things that affected the vitality of Nehiyawewen, which is the language that both Lana and myself are connected to. And so we had a tough job kind of to really sum it up into multiple categories. But this is how really what really we did deal with. And then we see, what all these here are expressed tangibility, like really what is the spirit of the language. This has been shared with us by community members and those in dialogue circles and elders and fluent speakers and those who are learning. And so what we constantly see in linguistic practice is, and necessarily I see a focus on right grammars and dictionaries, things like that. But when you're working with Nehiyawewen learners and learners of Indigenous languages, the connection to the land really becomes paramount. It is paramount. It's not just becomes paramount. It's the spirit is from the land itself, and it's been that way for thousands and thousands of years. So as soon as you remove that spirit of the language and put it into like a four-wall environment, you really remove the spirit of the language from the actual learning process. So that's why all of these elements here are so critical in actual supporting language vitality of Nehiyawewen and other indigenous languages, is because that's where the languages come from, right? And it's not as much learning for the purpose of acquisition. Hey, how are you? How's the season? How was your day? It's speaking with depth of each element and phoneme. It incorporates so much meaning, and so to not stray from that, but in fact to reconnect. So you'll see that that's the basis of our work. So if we're diving into colonization, capitalism, and Christianity, here are definitely some the historically linear effects that have come from each category. So from colonization, even prior to the doctrine of discovery, was terra nullius, which we'll see an example of shortly. This here is native land digital, and it's a method to reconceptualize how you see even maps, right? So you go from kind of land regions and territories, as opposed to hard and strict borders, which you see brought from the treaties signed between 1871 and 1877, and then with adhesions after. And now, of course, we're speaking from the Canadian context. I know this is an international conference, and so I should say, the language that we're working with primarily is Pasquao Nehiyawewen, which is Plains Cree. The language that I'm connected to with Nehiyawewen is Sagao Nehiyawewen, or Bush Cree. But we mutually intelligible. We speak to each other. So another page on colonization. Now again, this is just going through different examples, but every day there's something new that affects the vitality of Indigenous languages that's related and resultant to these three overarching categories. And we're quite happy to dive into detail about any of these, but given the limitations of this presentation, we wouldn't necessarily be able to go into each as richly as we have in our research. So, we see the dum diversas of capitalism, where people who are non-Christian weren't able to even contribute, even participate in trade. No, in fact, if you were not Christian, you could be stolen into slavery, and that's exactly what happened upon Columbus's landing. And you see that the precedent documents were there before, right? And it's easy to blame Columbus, but there are so many other examples of colonizers, particularly in Canada. I don't believe Columbus actually set foot on Turtle Island as we know it. And here we see the reasons that treaties were signed, right? And so if your subsistence, if your survival is dependent on bison, of which there were 50 million, and now there are 50 million wild bison, 30 million is a low estimate. And you see, this is just an example. This is skulls, 50,000 skulls of the bison. And so between the 1860s and early 1870s, there had been a slaughter, a governmentally enforced bison slaughter. And now if you're dependent on and relational in kinship with the bison, and there are millions, and suddenly there are none, you can see why people would have signed into treaties from previously being and still being self-subsistent, but what would be those factors? And then, of course, we have Christianity, the ones that the factors which would deny identity to someone for being non-Christian. And so, if you're not even recognized as a person, the lands you live on aren't recognized. Your sovereignty as a person is not recognized. You are therefore able to be stolen and subjected to slavery. So, we see other examples, of course. Residential schools is the big one. They began as experiments. It's said here 1780s, but I mean, you have missionaries even in the 1500s. 1610, 1670 is when it really had been determined that residential schools don't work. But there have been many, many, many cycles. And for those outside of Canada or North America, residential schools are coming to light as much more of the genocidal act that they have maintained. So here's an example of this is Edmonton Residential School, and this is Blue Quills, where Lana had brought up that it's the first Indigenous owned post-secondary institution in Canada. And so what happened was there was I believe it was a few weeks, a sit-in in this residential school, Blue Quills, in the photo on the right here. And it had been a residential school until that sit-in, which took place, I think, in 1970. And so after that long sit-in, it did finally become, in that year, the first First Nations-owned post-secondary institution in Canada. So just an example of taking that back, right? And so I'll pass this presentation now on to Lana as she discusses the reconnect, right? If these are the sources of disconnect, what are the methods and sources to reconnect?
Thank you, Kyle. So in our interviews with community members, we went to my reserve of Sad Lake, Cree Nation, Minnesticwin, and also identified language warriors, as we call them, educators, who are revitalizing languages. And so a lot of what they shared back was, and we started in ceremony, a smudge, and I mean, a lot of this work, especially if you were able to see some of those policies and laws that disconnected us from the spirit of the language, is also, I mean, there was a lot of heaviness when reading that work. So in this heaviness, we also hear some of those stories of language loss from our language warriors. So the solutions were about having community responsive education and learning through, learning through doing, watching and learning, like those traditional ways of our pedagogies. And of course, very important is that always being surrounded and in the language is ways of revitalizing and reconnecting to that, our traditional kinship. So again, like looking at those disconnections were so disconnections were very looking at reconnecting our kinships systems, right? And of course, learning through the land and being on the land and experiencing, some of our traditional ways of being, whether it was, making bows, fishing, all, reconnecting to the land and those relatives of the land, our animals, our plants, and being, having based in reciprocity and going back to thinking of those beings as our relatives. And so, and then having as our role of being a human relative is protecting and governing the learning connections. And reconnecting to the land, of course, we mentioned that it was really important to do land-based work. In this photo, you see Kyle, myself, and my adopted brother, Kevin Lewis, who started a land-based immersion Cree school in his community, in his home, where we're standing there. And so kind of, like a lot of our younger people taking up these, especially those who are fluent in the language, taking these initiatives and bringing them the community back and families back into learning on the land and connecting to that spirit of the land. You know, when you're learning through a medicinal plant, you are connecting to being related to that. And so when we're looking at, you know, generations of forced removal from the land, and how industry continues to be a force that is disconnecting us, and other organizations or corporations that are exploiting our lands and our plants. And so we need to move out of those kind of institutions that have such as the universities, and we shouldn't be limited by colonial boundaries placed on those bands and nations. We're just rushing through a lot of work. So as we mentioned, like, we start in ceremony as a way of connecting ourselves to the land and to one another's. And it's within ceremonies we learn the protocols and laws of how to be in good relations, especially those reciprocal relations. And so, you know, it's in the language, it's very much where we are, when you're speaking the language and learning the language, you are always in connection to all your living beings. Like, Cree is not, it's based in animate and inanimacy compared to, say, Latin based, which is very gendered. So we, you know, it's so important that we learn to share our stories, and especially our, you know, when we have been so affected by colonization, it actually impacted the way we share our stories. And so, you know, learning through arts and different ways of connecting to that spirit is so vital in learning the language, you know, through, as shared earlier with Kevin, of learning how to harvest, hunt, trap, are ways they're connecting to the language of the land. So it's, you know, when we look at, you know, all of the laws and policies that affected our disconnection, is like, now how do we change those laws and policies that they're learned, where we are being guided, where it's community owned and governed, instead of having you know, our governments, Western government systems, leading that. So, and I think it's also really important to know, like, colonization has affected many communities' abilities for self-government, and research shows that, you know, the less affected you are by, especially Indian residential schools, the more ability to have trauma responses and to be able to self-govern. And we consult, you know, when working in the language, it's so important that we work with our elders and our knowledge holders, and having, you know, them lead and own, and ownership is a whole nother kind of element of that we need to deconstruct and define, but that they are the ones who are holding and carrying in stewardship the practices of language revitalization. And so it's also really important to bring back a lot of what we've lost through that was stolen, including our, you know, our sacred knowledge and bundles. So these are just, maybe you can take this over, Kyle.
Sure. So here are just some learnings that we've had in collaboration, the process of collaborating with knowledge holders, with elders and fluent speakers and learners themselves, is, you know, for communities in envisioning a collaborative process with, let's say, linguists or institutions. These would be questions that community members would ask, you know, particularly around consent, protocol, process, respect, ceremony, protection of Indigenous knowledges. Any things like that. And then for you as a researcher, you might be quite interested in asking yourself or those community members, you know, how would you attain consent? How would you value and respect their intellectual property? What would you do to ensure that any ceremonial or community knowledges, which could be subject to international intellectual property theft, as has continually been the case around Indigenous knowledges is what would you do to ensure community sovereignty over those knowledges, as Lana was saying, Indigenous protected and governed languages. We see multiple examples, right? UNDRIP, OCAP, we see local contexts. These are all different ways to, and then we even community developed intellectual property laws, right? These are all different ways to ensure protections around community intellectual properties, of which languages inherently hold, right? Indigenous languages inherently have intellectual properties, right? And linguistic properties and knowledges about the land, even biomedicinal properties, right? Anything like that has been traditionally exploited. So the picture on the right here is an example of in a park here in Canada, writing on Stone Provincial Park, and it says Vision Quest, right? Press button to start. As if it's just that easy. Now, this is just an example, kind of sarcastically, of the reductionism that has come with Indigenous knowledges into making it accessible to an other. Now, it's of course not this easy. It's not pressing a button to start. There are so many ceremonies and protocols that go into place. So, an irony in the photo for people here to consider is what's their role as a linguist working with various marginalized or Indigenous languages. Thank you all so much for your time. And we're open very much to any questions. I know we, as Lana was saying, went through this quite fast. And it's quite a bit of research, and there's quite a lot of knowledge shared back with us by community members and knowledge keepers and elders. So with all due respect for them and their knowledges, we did rush through that.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic and completely excellent talk. Thank you. I was communicating during your talk with my colleagues, and we all are really admiring it. Well, while we are waiting for some questions to be written in the chat, maybe I'll dare to ask my own question in the very beginning. So, or like one of them, because I have a list of them here. So what do you think, what kind of activities there should be in the imaginary, the best variant of the world to strengthen the position of these indigenous languages? To any of you, whoever prefers to answer.
Definitely having, creating systems of support for Indigenous, language speakers to share. And I mean, even teaching language speakers how to teach, right? Like at Blue Quills, they've actually have a master's in Indigenous languages, which is the first. But we're always in competition with being that it's the only reserve in Canada for educational purposes. And again, used to be an Indian residential school. It was taken over by the Indigenous community members. Like my family were a part of the sit-in. Mm-hmm. And so, having, but we are always in competition for funding. We're always living in deficits in our Indigenous communities. So even just starting with like creating systems of, that economic support of, for our Indigenous owned and operated institutions.
Yeah.
It's true, and in that competition against academia and established post-secondary institutions, and the competition for funding, I mean, what that leads to supporting is, as we saw, Kevin Lewis leads a land-based immersion camp, and we've received partial funding for some of our research along the way, and pretty much any dedicated funding or any dedicated compensation, we give it back to Kevin Lewis. So we refund the land-based immersion camp. And so what they're doing, which is amazing, is they've built a birch bark canoe. The learners in that program have built it, and they're accredited program. They implement harvesting and ceremony, and this is all done in Indigenous languages. Every aspect of life, particularly Indigenous identity, comes with, I mean, that's emboldened in the language. So any of those harvesting or hunting or ceremonial or spiritual practices, anything that comes with Indigenous identity and nationhood is I mean, what you're asking for in this question is, you know, what would be tactile pedagogies for learning, right? Getting out on the land, really. And so that's it. That's ancestral harvesting, ancestral hunting. But when those rights are taken away, or when those animals are taken away, each opportunity that you have for that trans-species communication, right, discussing with the plant or with the animal, or engaging with the animal, pouring a hunted moose its last drink of water as you shoot it, that's part of the language. So you see a bit of that, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. There is a question from Javier. Would you like maybe to ask it yourself? And Javier Domingo, probably you could unmute yourself. It should be maybe he's not here. Yeah. Okay. So we have several minutes more. Did I understand you correct that this kind of school on the earth, together with real cultural practices, already exists, right? And how can we find it? Is there any like website or something for those who are interested in? Thank you.
Yeah, Kevin Lewis does have a website on Kaineyastic Culture Camp. Maybe Kyle, if you can put the link to share. There are other, as I mentioned, bluequills.ca is another that offers like a degree in Indigenous languages such as Cree and Dene into a master's. And I took my doctorate degree there, which prioritizes our language. And I grew up with the language, but I wasn't taught it, right? It wasn't passed. So one of the ways in which, you know, personally with Kyle and I, we're working on reclaiming our own languages while we're doing this work, which I do through art. I create digital stories in the language, as well as we are, because of our places within the academia, we are bringing some of that funding and helping and supporting and Indigenous initiatives within our communities that we're connected to. So, and just kind of answering a little bit of the question that was asked.
Thank you. I will probably read the question of Javier. So first of all, thank you. You mentioned what I would call a broad principles of language learning and teaching, like relationally and reciprocity. Could you talk more specifically about how you're learning and teaching the language? What specific exercises do you use?
So this is more specifically, like our work is meant to support others who are teachers and learners in the language. Lana and I are both committed learners of the language in various stages. Particularly, it's in our blood, it's in our ancestry. And so the concepts of relationality and reciprocity definitely inform, right, teaching and learning processes, as we were talking about before, even if it's that mutual respect. If it's dropping tobacco when you're harvesting. I mean, now what he's talking about here is how you're learning and teaching. And that's changed, I would say, since COVID, which, you know, some of the other presenters addressed in their own fieldwork, how that's changed, right, since COVID. And so I would say for Indigenous language learners, the internet in itself, which has an inherently English bias for Nahiawean learners. I mean, we all are here at a marginalized, at an endangered languages and minority languages conference, communicating mostly in English. So you see where that bias is inherent to the tools. So, I mean, with the land being the language, the land is the spirit of the language. That really is the teacher, right? Thousands and thousands of millennia of history. That's the teacher. That's the learning. And so, right, with all of these measures that have been in place, structurally, systemically, bureaucratically, everything, right, all this, you see how each affects that. And so the more that we can go back to that, the more the language becomes awakened in those processes. So yeah, in our work, supporting learners and teachers by saying, okay, these are the methods that have best been used for actual acquisition, and acquisition going outside of the hello, how are yous, into the depth of this is what makes up the word for this plant, for instance. Like there are so many different components. And so the more that you're able to actually, right, hold ceremony and hold space and hold time out in the land, that's, if you use it, but the word, the venue for learning, right, is to be reductionist. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Many, many thanks. Thank you so much. I think it's time for on-country learning in Central Australia. And Georgia Curran, a doctor of anthropology from University of Sydney, is one from this group. And yeah, can I ask you to join us, Georgia, because I see you on the list of the guests.
Yes, hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. To begin, I just want to acknowledge the Darug people of the Eora Nation of the Sydney area in Australia, from where I'm presenting to you today. It's very early in Australia, so my co-presenters aren't with me. So we've actually prepared a recording to present to you so that everyone can contribute to that. So I'll share that with you now. In the words of the Indigenous Australian ethnobotanist Jerry Turpin, biocultural knowledge encompasses people, language and culture and their relationships to the environment. In recent decades, there have been significant social and linguistic changes in Central Australia, such that people no longer live on country, but instead in centralised community areas. As a result, domains of ethnobiological knowledge surrounding plants and animals are fragile and mostly known by older generations. Yet the connections between people and their country are still highly valued aspects of Indigenous cultural heritage. Today, we will present on some of the learning resources that have been developed in Central Australian communities and which aim to assist in the transfer of detailed and highly fragile biocultural knowledge. Our colleague Mifini Turpin is also working with Kayaditj and Alyawara collaborators who live in communities further to the east of Central Australia. But as she's unavailable today, we will present some examples of resources that have been developed for Warlpiri language. Warlpiri speakers mostly live in 4 communities across the Tanami Desert: Yuendumu, Nirpi, Willaura, Lajamanu in the northern part of the Warlpiri region, and Warlpiri is also spoken in Tennant Creek, Alikurang and Alice Springs, as well as by a few speakers in various other places, including larger towns and cities around Australia. We will present examples from 3 different types of learning resources that we have been developing over many years, all of which assist with the transfer to future generations of complex ethnobiological knowledge. Ormay, Gallagher and Gretel Macdonald will present on mind maps which have been developed at the Yuendumu School's Bilingual Resource Development Unit. Mary Laughren will present some examples from the soon-to-be-published Warlpiri Dictionary, and I, Georgia Curran, will present some examples from Warlpiri songbooks.
Nangala, Ormay Kalatke, Migan I am going to talk about country, Mura, Murara, Waya, which is that they are all in one. In this mind map, it has everything we need to learn. Who is the traditional owner? Kira. That is Jambijinba, Nambijinba, Nangala, Changala, and we also have who is the caretaker? Korongola. For Jambijinba, Nambijinba, we have Tapajari Napajari. And for Nangala Changala, we have Tapananga Napananga. The caretakers, they look after the country. What streaming belongs to, who it belongs to. Chukotpa, Manakram. It is a Warangi, grandfather, with his father's father, Chachi, our father, and Pimere, our auntie. And we follow their footsteps. And we learn our children to know about their grandfather's Sukota and pass it on to their children and future. In a country, Walanja, we have creeks, Karo, and waterhole, Wanere, and all different kinds of trees, water. And we also have other things. We also have bush food, that we can collect and hunt. We have bush meat like kangaroo, marlo, bawana, madapi, and many others. We also know where the countries and the distance and which way we can go, like for Mikanji, so it's Kalara. In this mind map, we have everything that we can teach the children to learn. Kappa teachers have thought about this. We worked and talked with elders and families together. Talking strong to teach their children at school. Elders work with the skin groups and put in stories, image of what they have in the country, this was our idea for our children, what they need to learn about the country, Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gretel Macdonald, and I'm a linguist, and I work here at the Bilingual Resource Development Unit, Ormay. And we do a lot of work on developing Walkley curriculum and making resources to support that. And I just wanted to say that I did learn a lot from working with Ormay on developing these mind maps with other Walkley teachers. It showed me how country is not just a simple concept, it's quite complex with a lot of different aspects, whether it's the actual animals and plants that you find in your country or the way you're connected to your family. And it did also remind me that to know country well, Walkley kids have to visit a lot. And get to know what that country looks like, where it is, and again, those connections. And one more comment about the mind maps is Ormay came up with this idea to make mind maps with Walbury educators, and it was a really great way to bring everyone together, like elders and family and Walbury teachers, to talk about those important aspects of country that kids need to learn about. So it was a good process, and I think it's going to be a good resource for kids learning.
In this part of our talk, we want to illustrate how the Walbury to English Encyclopedic Dictionary will serve not only as a record of traditional Walbury language, but also of traditional Walbury knowledge about the environment in which Walbury people have lived and continue to live. And we will illustrate this with a small number of entries, or information from entries about animals and plants. To give a little background, the dictionary contains some very detailed information about many plants and animals that have been provided by Walbury people. And this information has been recorded by linguists, wildlife experts, teachers, anthropologists and others since the late 1950s. The main sources of information on the plants and animals come from two sources. First of all, the documentation carried out by the linguist Ken Hale, and also the information.
Sorry, that's my fault. This is Rita. Georgia, can you unmute yourself? There was a sound, so I thought it was an echo. Apologies, my fault.
In-house documentation of the Walbury language consists of a large number of oral recordings, the transcriptions of these recordings, and other field notes. The Walbury men who Ken recorded produced some wonderful oral essays, and these were men who had lived a traditional or partly traditional life, hunting and gathering food in their Walbury country. These recordings really captured the men's intimate knowledge of the environment in which they'd grown up and lived their adult lives. The bilingual education programs, which started in 1973 in Walbury community schools, first at Yuendumu and then at Laughren and later at Napier. While these programs have been running, very extensive documentation has been recorded through collaboration between Walbury elders, school-based Walbury teachers and literacy workers, linguists, and many others. The documentation recorded in Walbury books, particularly, and the teaching materials can be found in the Living Archive of Aboriginal Languages at the Charles Darwin University in Darwin. Some of the types of information in the entries for plants and animals includes, obviously, the name of the plant or animal, a description of its physical properties, and this often involves a comparison with similar plants or similar animals. The habitat, the behaviour of the animal or also of the plant, whether the animal or plant is considered food or not, how it is prepared for eating or other uses, what these uses are, whether it's food, tools, weapons, medicine, ceremonial objects, etc., and also the religious and social values that are associated with the particular plant or animal. In the Walbury to English section of the dictionary, the Walbury name, of course, comes first, and then it is paired, where known, with an English common name and also the Latin scientific name. Also, where there are synonyms, these are also given. Walbury, of course, is made up of a number of different dialects. It's a language which is spoken over a very large area, and a plant may be known by different terms in different parts of Walbury country. As a sample of the information given about the physical description of plants and animals, here is the entry for Kanalarambi, which is the common English name is the Halls Creek wattle. It produces an edible seed. The tree has broad leaves. The flowers come out first and they open up. The seed pods are small at first. They appear. They grow larger. And then the sun ripens them, dries them, then the husk starts to peel off. Similarly, for a species of red ant called Wonder Wonder, here the Wonder Wonder ants are yellowish, but it's really very red, the colour of their bodies. In the entry for the desert raisin, Kamburarba, we have a nice example of how the speakers used comparison with like species as a way of describing either the habitat or the physical properties or the uses or whatever of what they were speaking about. So here we learn about these, there's a comparison being made between the desert raisin and the bush raisin. So the bush raisin berries, if you eat them, they've got two names, Kararaba and Yakajiri. Then you can get a headache from eating them. They're good food to be eaten, but you can get a headache from bush raisins. Whereas from eating desert raisins, the Kamburarba, you don't get a headache. They do look just like bush raisins. The plant is the same and the leaves, but the desert raisins grow in sandhill country. So we have here a difference of habitat. Kamburarba, the desert raisin, it's a plant just like the bush raisin plant, with the same sort of prickles, those same little ones. Both the bush raisin and the desert raisin have edible berries. The entry for the desert raisin, Kamburarba, also gives us some additional information about the habitat. So desert raisins are found in sandhill country. Desert raisin plants don't grow close to sandy creeks or in mulga country. They only grow on sand ridges. They grow on hillsides and close to the sand ridges. Some aspects of the behaviour of the swallow type birds, the fairy martin and the tree martin, both of which go by the name Kalingajirimbu. And we learn that they grab at flies, mosquitoes and other insects. They all move up and down very quickly. Flocks of them perch in trees in the scrub or along creek beds, and they make their nests up in hollow trees. And about these red-brown ants, we learn that the red ants dig and leave mounds of dirt around the sides of their hole. They dig big holes and deposit big mounds of dirt, like when they dig down. The red ants heap up the dirt behind them. The Wonder ants cannot fly. They just move around on the ground and don't fly. In the entry for the Kanalarambi, the Halls Creek wattle, we learned something about how the seeds, the edible seeds, were prepared for eating. That people see that they're ready to collect. They're happy when they see that. Oh, there's seeds for us. Let's go and thresh the seeds. People break off the branches of the tree, first of all, and they put them down on the ground in a cleared spot. They then thresh the branches with sticks. They then shake the branches by hand to make sure that all the seeds are off them. Then they winnow the seeds in their coulamans, or wooden dishes. They carry the seeds home in their wooden dishes. They get a big stone, a flat grindstone, and a small one they hold in their hands. And before grinding the seeds, they cook them in the wooden dishes. They put hot coals and ashes onto the seeds to cook them. Then they winnow the cooked seeds a second time to make sure they're clean, and then they put them onto the grindstone to be ground. They put a flat wooden dish under the grindstone, and the soft ground paste runs into the dish. It's then given to the husbands, sons and daughters for them to eat. After eating it, everyone feels satisfied. The entry for the Wonder, the red ants, contains interesting information about how these ants were used. So we find out that the red ants are round ones like honey ants, and they live under the ground and like honey ants. And as young girls, we used to dig them up and eat them. We also learned that the young girls used to put red Wonder ants onto their breasts. They used to do it for fun. The ants would bite and sting them, and the Wonder ants would bite them with their teeth. They would bite away at their breasts, then their breasts would swell up as a result of the ant bites. And finally, we see that in many of the entries, the groups of people who have a special association with a Dreamtime ancestral personage, and which also links to place, is also, that information is also given in the dictionary entries. So for the fairy martin dreaming, the bird dreaming, belongs to members of the Jungala and Jumbadin Papatra couple.
In the final examples that we will give today, we will discuss the Warlpiri song documentation projects, which have been going on for the last few decades. One way in which complex forms of interconnected knowledge have been traditionally transmitted is through song. As is the case with other Indigenous Australian communities, singing traditions are the primary means by which place-specific biocultural knowledge is passed on through generations, seasons, and shifting social and ecological contexts. As Warlpiri songs are mostly known and performed by the older generations, projects to document songs and support their passing on to future Warlpiri people are also important for documenting biocultural knowledge, as they encompass the holistic knowledge of religious beliefs, language, kinship, and the environment together. These books are some of the outputs of song documentation projects that we have been collaborating on over many years. I'll share a few brief examples from these books of song verses which contain ethnobiological knowledge. In this verse from a Watiawanu Yawuyu song set, women's songs about the broom wattle dreaming, the words for two different trees are used. Yalpiyaru, the blue mulga, and Watiawanu, the broom wattle. Additional information passed on with this song explains that initially the ancestral women vocal to this story struck down the Waraji mulga trees that grow in the same country, as they're easy to mistake for the Yalpiyaru tree. This information is passed on with this song to ensure that Warlpiri women know the difference between these two plants, this being crucial knowledge as one has juicy edible seeds and one does not. In this song verse from the Minamina Yawuyu about the travel of a group of ancestral women across Warlpiri country, further knowledge about food sources on trees is relayed. This verse describes the ways in which the desert oak trees bend over, laden with accumulated sap, which Warlpiri people take from the tree and eat as a sweet. And in this final example, the verse contains important knowledge about particular seeds and the ways in which they can be cooked. Some Warlpiri seeds can be ground to a paste, as Mary described before in the example from the dictionary, but they do not solidify as a seed cake or bread-like food. This verse describes how the Watiawanu acacia seeds disintegrate if they are cooked under the earth. Additional information passed on with this song explains that these seeds are eaten as raw paste rather than cooked. The mind maps, dictionary and songbooks, which we have presented examples from, have all come out of long-term community projects which result in resources which can be used to teach younger generations about the interconnections between traditional knowledge, associated domains of language, which are often highly endangered. And these resources are ways of assisting the transfer of understanding of a person's role in their community and in their environment.
Thank you very much for the talk. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm happy to take any questions about any part of that now.
Yeah. While we're waiting for other questions, I can ask several of mine. So is that correct that those songs you show in the final part of your talk, they're presented on this live archive website, and one can hear those songs there together with words and notes and everything?
Yes, so the songs are actually on a different website. The Living Archive reference that I gave at the end there, and which Mary also referred to, has digital copies of all of the Walpre books at the school. So these are, a lot of them contain traditional knowledge too, and they're aimed at teaching. They're sort of at reading levels for children to develop literacy at school. The songs are linked in two ways. They've both got audio links in them. One is through a sound pen, which can come separately, and it links to recordings which are on a website. And in the second book, there's QR codes that we updated that, just because of the time period between the two of them, but they're all available on the Bachelor Institute website, and more information about the projects too.
Great, thank you. We've got one more question from Radu. Could you please ask your question?
Yeah, just a very quick one, and sorry, I'm mostly known for asking irrelevant questions, or irrelevant for most people, but I'm interested in the musical notation there. So is there just a notation for the length of the notes, or do we have pitch? Because I didn't see any, grill, or so is it reflecting exactly what they do, what it sounds like? Or I may have missed a few slides. Or...
Oh, okay. No, I think, you've raised an important point. In the books, we've only transcribed the rhythm of the the songs. Of course, when they're sung, they have a melody too, and this is really important, linked to particular country. The melody is often iconic of particular country, but it changes with each repetition of the songs. It's a cyclical repetition, and it depends on the performance instance. So we just made the decision for the books to the rhythm and the song words, which were the two standards.
So the rhythm in this case is actually more important than the melody itself.
Yeah, well, that's a tricky one to answer. It's more standard and will be repeated the same with each performance instance. The melody is very important too. As I said, it links to particular country. So the tune of a song will be the thing that reminds, triggers people's memory.
Yeah. So, okay, this is the standard rhythm that can be applied or overimposed on different melodies.
Yes, yeah, and sung in a cyclical fashion. So it starts at a different point of that melody, which is why it's so difficult to transcribe in a
no, that's a good choice, actually.
Questions in the previous talk, I guess, around representation too. It's, we've always got to be thinking about what's being represented in a book like this. We can't capture everything. So and just acknowledging that has been a big important part of this as well.
Thank you so much, George.
Thank you. We have several more questions, and one request. Could you please insert in the chat those links? I think both of them, because the presentation disappeared and we still want to follow those links. And yet, Dalvin, could you ask your question at the same time? I think it's possible. please, you're welcome.
Yeah, sorry, it's Nick. I'm using someone else's account, sorry about that. So the question was, how many fluent Warlpiri speakers are there around at the moment? Is it increasing, decreasing? I was just interested to know.
Yeah, so there's, I think the estimate currently is around 3,000 speakers across quite a broad area. So that encompasses probably 4 dialects of Warlpiri. Up in Laughren, the more northern Warlpiri community, there's a light Warlpiri version spoken, as well as older people speaking a more traditional version.
What does that mean?
There's been research done, I say that word because they've called it light Warlpiri, where there's more English words coming into it. It's differing from a Creole, which is also spoken in the region just north to that as well. So it's, I guess it's specific Warlpiri grammatical ways of incorporating English structures into that version of Warlpiri. Yeah, and of course children are still learning it regularly in the schools, most coming to school with Warlpiri as their first language. And there's been quite a few controversial education policies over the last decade or so. There's been a very strong bilingual education program in Warlpiri schools, and in the last 5 to 10 years there's been an introduction of English only for the first 4 hours of the day, which is obviously very difficult for children who don't speak English before they come to school. So that's been very controversial, but fortunately there's great Warlpiri teachers who speak Warlpiri to the children, you know, in the day, even if they are doing English as well, in those first 4 hours.
That sounds really good. Well, thanks. Partly.
Yes, there's some negative parts too.
I will use my privilege to ask one more question. You started with this opposition of rural and city culture, and that this is a problem for the rural culture, right? When more and more people are concentrating in large cities. So that's why I have a short practical question. Are there in the cities, for example, musical concerts with the songs in endangered local languages, or some kind of a fashion, of a city fashion to these kind of cultures and languages?
Yeah, so I get across Australia there's many different Aboriginal languages spoken. Languages from the city there are, which I think earlier today for you, Darug was spoken about from the Sydney area of Australia, and the kind of revival, whatever word is being used, their programs that are around that. So there's definitely musicians that sing in Darug and cities. The Warlpiri women singers who I work with often get asked to come to cities too to perform, which is quite a new thing, and sing mostly on country around in their own worlds. That desert area is quite broad and expansive, and Alice Springs is the central town in Australia where people often come and may perform as well. But most of that musical action is kind of occurring in the bush and around in the communities in the desert.
I'm muted. Thank you very much for this excellent talk and presentation. I think it's time to move to the Gaelic fiction reading event.